The smoke came in low that August, pressed flat against the ridgeline by a wind that couldn't decide which way it wanted to blow. He watched it from the catwalk with the field glasses pressed hard enough to leave a ring around his eyes, and when he came back down into the cabin, he didn't write about the fire first. He wrote about the letter. August 14, 1961. Forest Service surveyor came again today, second time this month. Says the boundary runs different than what my father's deed says. Told him I have the paper to prove otherwise. He laughed at me. Fires building past Tamarack Creek, moving slow, but moving. If they pull us out before I get this sorted, I don't know what becomes of the claim. He underlined the claim. Twice. Hard enough that the nib caught and split a little in the leather-bound book, and then he set the pen down and went to check the water barrel, because a man could only fight one fire at a time, and the one on the mountain was closer. 33 years later, a girl climbed the same collapsed trail with a hatchet in one hand and a coil of clothesline rope over her shoulder, and she didn't know any of that. She only knew what the gas station clerk in the valley had told her when she asked about a place to camp cheap and quiet, that Cinder Ridge Lookout had been empty since before his own father was born, that people said the tower was haunted, that nobody bothered going up there anymore because the trail had slid out years back and swallowed itself whole. Haunted was fine by her. Haunted meant nobody looked too hard, and nobody looking too hard was exactly what she needed after 3 weeks of hitching rides north out of a house she wasn't going back to. Not for anything, not for anyone. She'd found a flat shelf of ground below the switchbacks, sheltered by a stand of lodgepole pine, and she'd been sleeping there 4 nights already under a lean-to made from a blue tarp and good knots. The only 2 useful things her last foster father had taught her, tying tarps and staying quiet. Firewood was the problem now. The deadfall near her camp was already stripped bare, and the only unburned timber left was higher up, past where the trail buckled into a wall of loose shale and uprooted brush that looked like the mountain had simply given up holding itself together. She set the hatchet down, wiped her palms on her jeans, and studied the rock slide the way she'd learned to study everything lately, for weakness, for a way through, for whatever nobody else had bothered to notice. Somewhere under all that broken stone, she was almost sure, the old trail still ran straight and true, and firewood was waiting on the other side of it. The first hour of digging taught her nothing except that most of the slide was exactly what it looked like. Shale and dirt and busted brush, tumbled down in the ordinary way mountains shed themselves. But there was a patch, maybe 8 feet wide, low against the slope where the trail should have cut through, that didn't sit right. The rocks there were bigger, flatter, and they leaned against each other at angles that felt considered instead of accidental, like someone had piled them on purpose and let time and weather dress the pile up as natural ruin. She noticed it the way she noticed most things now, sideways and quiet, and then couldn't stop noticing it. She didn't tell herself a story about what it meant. She just started moving rock, one piece at a time, wedging smaller stones loose first and rolling them down slope, working an hour before dawn and an hour before dark so the heat of the day wouldn't burn through what little food she had left. Her hands blistered and then calloused. She learned which rocks would slide clean and which would bring a half-ton of gravel down with them. Learned to read the pile the way she'd learned to read a room full of strangers, watching for what wanted to move and what would fight her. By the 4th day, she'd cleared enough to see that the flat stones weren't resting on more rubble. They were resting on timber, old, silvered, half-rotted timber, laid crosswise like a deliberate barrier, like a door someone had wanted buried, rather than simply left to fall. 33 years earlier, the letter had come up the mountain in a Forest Service mail pouch, stiff with an official seal, that meant somebody down in the district office had finally stopped writing him personal notes and started writing him legal ones. He read it standing on the tower catwalk, with the wind pulling at the pages, and he read it twice more that night by lamplight, elbows on the logbook, before he wrote anything down. Notice of eviction and boundary dispute filed against unpatented occupancy. They say the homestead claim was never perfected. They say the acreage reverts to Forest Service administration. They are wrong, and I have the survey to prove it, filed with the county in my mother's family name before this district existed. I will not be moved off ground my grandfather cleared by a man who has never once climbed this ridge. He underlined. Never once. Hard enough to tear the paper, then blotted the ink and closed the book, and outside the wind kept working at the tower the way it had every night for 6 years, patient and unbothered, the way mountains are about men and their paperwork. The rock came away in her hands easier than she expected, the last of the slide loosened by 3 days of steady prying with a fence post she'd found half buried in the scree. She'd learned to read the pile the way she imagined a mason read a wall, which stones were load-bearing, which were just resting on each other out of habit. Underneath the top layer, the rubble had settled into a kind of shell, hollow-sounding when she knocked her knuckles against it, and that was what had kept her coming back each morning instead of giving up and hauling deadfall from somewhere easier. When the last slab tipped free and rolled down the slope with a sound like a dropped stove lid, she found herself looking at wood. Not a natural gap, not a lucky cave mouth. Planks, gray and swollen with age, fitted edge to edge, and braced with iron strapping gone the color of old blood. A door, built flush into the cut bank, with hinges on the inside so it opened away from whoever tried to force it. Somebody hadn't wanted this found by accident. She worked the fence post into the seam where the bolt plate had rusted through its screws and leaned her whole weight against it. The wood groaned, resisted, groaned again, and then gave all at once, dropping her forward onto her knees on a threshold that hadn't felt weight in longer than she'd been alive. The smell hit her first, dust and cold iron, and something faintly like pine tar, sealed and stale but not rotten. She struck a match with hands that weren't quite steady, and the small flare showed her shelves, rows of cans, labels faded to ghost print but still upright, still in order. A wood stove squatting against the far wall, its door hanging open on a cold black mouth of ash nobody had ever shoveled out. Coils of rope hung on pegs like sleeping snakes. 2 oil lamps sat on a plank table, glass chimneys clouded but unbroken, and beside them a folded wool blanket so precisely creased it looked like it had been set down 5 minutes ago instead of decades. She lit one of the lamps, unwilling to waste more matches, and the room bloomed into soft yellow light that made everything look less like a tomb and more like a house somebody had simply stepped out of. There was a cot along one wall, blankets tucked with the kind of tight corners only certain men learned in the army or in fire crews, a hand tool rack, a shelf of tinned goods that could still, for all she knew, be edible. She stood there a long moment, lamp raised, breathing slow, before she saw the second shelf, narrow, waist-high, holding nothing but a single leather-bound book set square in the center like it had been left there on purpose, waiting for someone to finally come far enough to find it. Bethany set the lamp on the plank table and lifted the book with both hands, the way she might have lifted something that could still bite her. The cover was stiff, cracked along the spine, but the leather had held its shape under decades of dust and stillness. She wiped her palm across the front and opened it to the first page. Cinder Ridge Lookout, Fire Season Log. The header read, followed by a name she couldn't make out under a smear of old ink, and beneath that, the year, 1961. The early entries were what she expected: weather notes, smoke sightings, supply counts, the dry shorthand of a man doing his job. But as she flipped deeper, the handwriting changed. Not sloppier exactly, tighter, deliberate, like someone pressing the pen harder to make sure the words survived whatever came next. August 14th. Fire crossing the ridgeline east of the saddle. Evac order confirmed by radio, 1400 hours. She turned the page, expecting panic, expecting the scrawl of a man running for his life. Instead, the next entry was almost calm. Boarded the north window first. Bolts from the tool shed, 6-inch, should hold against wind and animals both. Cabin stores enough for a man who knows how to ration, not for the service to find easy. Bethany read it twice, not fleeing a fire, sealing a door. She set the lamp closer and kept reading, the oil hissing faint in the quiet. The next few pages weren't about smoke or wind direction at all. They were about boundary lines, a grazing dispute, a survey the ranger claimed had been drawn wrong on purpose to cut his family's homestead acreage down to nothing. He wrote about a meeting in town that had gone poorly, about men who wore Forest Service badges and spoke to him like his signature meant nothing. Then, near the bottom of one page, in smaller, harder letters, "If they want the tower, they can have the tower. The land underneath it is mine by right. Whatever the map in the district office says, I'll seal what's mine and let them think what they like." Bethany's hands had gone still on the page. Outside, the wind moved through the collapsed rock above, a low grinding hush, and she barely heard it. Tucked into the back cover, folded twice, was a second document, a hand-drawn topographic map, the contour lines inked with a steady, patient hand, nothing like the panic scrawl she'd imagined from a man running ahead of fire. A small parcel had been marked near the lookout, boxed off in careful right angles, initialed in the corner. She lowered the book slowly onto her knee, lamp flickering against the cabin's stone walls, and understood with a small, cold certainty that whatever had happened here in 1961, nobody had died in that fire. Somebody had planned this, boarded this door himself, brick by bolt, calm as a man locking up a house he intended to come back to, or one he never intended anyone else to open. She turned back to the beginning of the book, where the ink was steadier and the handwriting hadn't yet learned to press so hard into the page. The early entries were plain as chore lists. June 3. Fire danger moderate. Cleaned glass. Recalibrated the Osborne. Supply mule due Tuesday, didn't come. June 9th. Patched stovepipe. Wind out of the west all day, visibility good to 40 miles. Weather, wildlife, the small failures of equipment. A man doing a quiet job in a quiet place, writing to no one but himself and whoever might read it after. Then, threaded through the ordinary entries, a name began to recur. A district supervisor, referred to only by title, never softened with any kindness. Supervisor wrote up again about the fence line on the south slope, told him same as before, that ground was never Forest Service ground. My grandfather filed on it before there was a district office to file with. Bethany read that line twice. She thought of the boxed parcel on the map tucked in the back cover, the careful right angles, the initials. The entries grew more frequent after that, more clipped. Supervisor says the boundary survey from '48 supersedes any homestead claim I can't produce paper for. Told him I have paper. He didn't ask to see it. Another, weeks later. Cattle moved onto the south slope without my say. Not the district's business where my grazing runs. Wrote to the county recorder for a copy of the original filing, in case mine is ever lost or taken. She could feel the man tightening on the page, sentence by sentence, the way rope tightens when somebody starts pulling from the other end and won't stop. By midsummer of that year, the tone had gone past frustration into something more careful, more deliberate. A man building a case, stacking one fact on another like a wall he meant to stand behind. Supervisor threatens to report the boundary dispute up the line, have it settled by the district in Portland. Let them. I have the deed language memorized by now. My mother's people held this ground before the district existed, and no man riding up here on a Tuesday changes that by saying so. Bethany set the lamp closer and read that page a third time, trying to hear past the anger to whatever plain fact was underneath it. A homestead claim, a family deed older than the Forest Service boundary lines. A supervisor who wouldn't look at paper he'd been offered. Whatever came next in these pages, the fire, the sealed door, the man who walked away from a burning district and never came back to any office that would have him, it hadn't started with panic. It had started with a fence line and a stubborn certainty that the ground under his own boots belonged to him. She turned the page, and the handwriting changed again, tightening further, as if the man writing it already knew, that summer, exactly what he meant to do before the smoke ever came. The lamp burned low before she made herself stop reading and start working. Words wouldn't keep the rain out, and the roof had already told her, in 3 separate leaks over 2 nights, that it didn't care about deed language or district boundaries. She spent the better part of a morning up on the slope side of the cabin, prying back curled shingles with a flat bar she'd found among the tools, checking the sheathing underneath with her palm, the way she'd learned checking a horse's leg for heat. Press, wait, feel. 2 boards had gone soft and dark. She cut them out with a handsaw dulled by decades of disuse, sharpened it on a stone she found in a tin of odds and bolts, and fit new lengths from a stack of lumber stored dry under a tarp at the back of the cabin, as if the ranger had meant to get around to this repair himself and simply run out of summers. The stovepipe gave her more trouble. When she finally worked the flue open, a fall of soot and old creosote came down thick enough to blacken her hands past the wrist, and beneath it, something like a bird's nest, long abandoned, packed hard against the damper. She cleared it handful by handful, coughing, eyes stinging, until air moved through the pipe again in a clean, straight draw she could feel against her palm. That evening she lit the stove for the first time and watched smoke rise steady from the chimney outside instead of curling back into the room, and something in her loosened at the sight of it, small and unreasonable and real. It was on the walk down for water, boots sliding on wet slate, that she turned the rumor over again. Down in the valley, the old-timers who remembered anything at all said the ranger died in the '61 fire, burned trying to save the tower, or lost on the mountain in smoke so thick a man couldn't find his own hands. She'd heard a version of it second-hand from the feed store clerk, delivered like settled fact. But a man who burned to death didn't seal a cabin door with bolts driven from the inside out. He didn't leave canned goods stacked square on shelves, or coil rope with a sailor's care, or write in a steady hand about fence lines weeks, maybe days, before whatever happened happened. Bodies left behind and buried didn't lock up behind themselves. She set the water buckets down at the spring and let the cold sink into her hands, thinking about how a story could outlive the truth it was supposed to hold, the way rumor filled a gap a man left on purpose. Whoever started that tale hadn't wanted to say the ranger simply walked off angry and never came back. It was easier, maybe, to bury him in fire than to admit the district had lost him to a grudge. She carried the buckets back up the slope and set them by the stove before she let herself open the logbook again to the last pages, the ones she'd been rationing like the last of the coffee, unwilling to finish what there was to read. August 9th. The hand was steadier here than in the entries about the fire line, steadier than the ones complaining about survey stakes moved 20 feet east of where they'd stood the summer before. Met with the district supervisor again. He will not hear the boundary as surveyed in 48, says the grazing allotment stands regardless of what the old plat shows. I told him I would take it to the county. He laughed at that, not unkindly, but laughed. August 14th. Shorter, the ink darker, like the pen had been pressed too hard. A man can spend a year in court and lose more than the land arguing for it. I have thought on this since the meeting. There is another way, quieter, and it does not require anyone's permission. August 20th. Here the hand changed again, careful and slow, the way a man writes when he means every word to survive him. My mother's name was Alderidge before she married. I will use it where I go. No one in the valley will know it, and that is the point. A ranger who disappears is a story men tell over coffee. A man with a new name starting fresh is only a man. Then, taking up nearly the whole page, block letters, copied with the patience of someone transcribing something he could not afford to get wrong. A legal description, meets and bounds, creek to ridge to a marked pine and back again, the kind of language she'd only ever seen in the county recorder's dusty ledgers, glimpsed once through a courthouse window. This parcel is mine by patent, filed and paid for by my father before me, separate from any allotment the district thinks it holds. I set this down here so it is not lost with me. Whatever they say happened to me. The cabin stays as it stands. Let it wait. The last line, added below in a hand gone rougher, hurried. If anyone reads this, know I did not die on this mountain. I only stopped being the man they wanted to argue with. Bethany sat with the book open on her knees a long while, the stove ticking as it cooled, and understood that what she was holding wasn't just a diary of a grudge. It was a claim, laid out plain as a fence line, waiting 40 years for someone to walk it out and prove it still stood. Outside, the light was going long and gold across the slope, and she thought of the courthouse in the valley town, its ledgers, its patient clerks, and how far a person might get with nothing but a name that wasn't the one the mountain remembered. The truck she borrowed from the feed store owner rattled the whole way down the grade, and she kept one hand on the logbook where it sat wrapped in a flour sack on the seat beside her, as if it might slide out the window if she wasn't careful. The Valley Town Courthouse was a squat brick building with a flag gone pale from years of weather, and inside it smelled like floor wax and old paper, the kind of smell that made her think of libraries and church basements at once. The clerk at the recorder's window was an older woman with reading glasses on a chain, who looked at her canvas jacket and dirt-creased hands with the mild suspicion small towns reserved for anyone unfamiliar, but softened when Bethany asked her question plainly. She was looking for a homestead patent, filed sometime before 1961, under a name that wasn't the one on the Forest Service maps. It took the better part of an afternoon. The clerk pulled ledger after ledger, heavy leather-bound volumes with tissue-thin pages, and Bethany copied section numbers onto a scrap of notebook paper the way she'd learned copying trail markers. Careful, exact, checking twice. She matched the parcel description from the logbook, line by line, against the recorder's plat maps, running her finger along township and range numbers until the shapes on the yellowed paper matched the ridge she'd walked 100 times without knowing its legal name. There it was, a parcel of a little over 6 acres, patented decades before the Forest Service ever drew its boundary around Cinder Ridge, filed under the maiden name the ranger had signed at the bottom of his last entry. The plat showed the tower site sitting square inside the parcel's northeast corner, the cabin below it just inside the line, both of them resting on land the district had apparently never bothered to reconcile against its own maps. No transfer recorded, no tax delinquency filed, no later claim overriding it, just a patent, sitting quiet in a drawer for over 30 years, waiting. The clerk leaned over the desk to look for herself, adjusting her glasses, and said what Bethany already suspected but hadn't let herself say aloud, that as far as the county was concerned, whoever held that name, or their heirs, still owned that ground outright, lookout tower and all, and the Forest Service had no more claim to it than the highway had to somebody's front yard. Bethany copied the parcel number a second time, slower now, hands steadier than she expected, and asked the clerk the only question that mattered after that. Not whether the claim was real, she already knew that, but whether there was any way, from these same dusty shelves, to trace where that name, and whoever carried it now, might still be living. The clerk sent her 2 doors down to the Historical Society, a single room above the feed store where a retired schoolteacher kept newspaper-bound volumes stacked by decade and a card catalog she trusted more than any computer index the county might someday afford. Bethany explained what she needed in careful, sanded-down sentences, the way she'd learned to explain anything to strangers who might decide, mid-sentence, that she wasn't worth their time. The schoolteacher didn't blink. She pulled 1961 without being asked twice. Then 1962, laying the brittle pages open on a slanted reading table under a gooseneck lamp. The fire made the front page twice, both times without much detail. Acreage burned, roads closed. No mention of a ranger by name. Official records apparently as thin as the Forest Service's own file had been. But the maiden name from the logbook surfaced twice more, further back in the classifieds and society notices, tied to a wedding announcement from 1958, and, later, a birth notice in 1963. A daughter. Same surname line running forward through a handful of school honor roll mentions in the 70s, then a wedding announcement of her own that changed it again. Bethany worked the thread patiently, the way she'd learned to follow a fence line through brush, not by the whole path but by finding the next post and trusting the one after that would show itself. A obituary for the mother, 1981, listed a surviving daughter and a town. The town was the one she was standing in. The schoolteacher, watching her work it out loud without meaning to, finally said the name might still be in the local phone directory and went to check. It was. One listing, an address on a street Bethany recognized from the drive-in, small houses with porches close to the road. She copied the address onto the same scrap of paper as the parcel number, folded it into her jacket pocket, and stood there a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the logbook's weight through the canvas bag, even though she hadn't brought it that day, hadn't been ready to. Riding back up the grade that evening, engines straining on the switchbacks, she rehearsed what she might say to a woman who was, by now, likely well into her 70s, a stranger showing up with her father's private words in hand, the last account he'd ever written down, hidden away for over 3 decades in a cabin nobody but Bethany had thought to look for. She didn't know if the daughter would be grateful or wounded, glad of the truth or unsettled, that it had waited this long to surface. But she knew she couldn't keep the logbook sealed in her own hands any longer than the mountain had kept it sealed in its own. The porch had a swing on it, chains gone rusty at the hooks, and a woman was sitting there shelling early peas into a bowl when Bethany came up the walk. She didn't stand right away. She looked at the canvas bag, then at Bethany's face, like she was deciding something before either of them had said a word. "You're the one who's been up at the lookout," the woman said. Not a question. Ranger Station office called the Historical Society. Historical Society called me. Small towns. Bethany nodded and held out the bag with both hands, the way she might hand over something breakable. "This was your father's. I found it in a cabin below the tower. It was sealed up since 1961. I didn't know that when I started reading it. I want you to know that. I read it because I didn't understand what I was looking at yet." The woman took the bag onto her lap and opened it slow, fingers finding the leather cover before her eyes did. She didn't cry, which surprised Bethany, though she'd later think she shouldn't have expected tears from a woman who'd apparently had 30 years to make peace with whatever this was. He talked about that tower more than he ever talked about anywhere else he lived, she said. "Told us stories at supper my whole childhood, the wind up there, the way the valley looked at first light. We always thought he was talking about some place he'd lost." She turned a few pages, slow, careful, like the paper might still be fragile from smoke even though it wasn't. Turns out he never lost it at all, just walked away and never told anybody why. Bethany explained what she'd pieced together. The boundary dispute, the sealed door, the name change, the copied parcel description, in his own hand, near the back of the book. The woman listened without interrupting, nodding at parts she must have half known already, filling in pieces Bethany hadn't had, that her father had lived 2 towns over under his mother's maiden name for the rest of his life, working timber and later running a small hardware counter, that he'd never once gone back up the mountain, not because he was afraid of it, but because leaving had been the only way he knew to keep the argument from following him. "He wasn't ashamed," the woman said finally. "I don't think he was, anyway. I think he just got tired of fighting people who had more paper than he did." She closed the logbook gently and set it on the swing beside her, then looked up at Bethany with something that wasn't grief at all, something closer to relief. "You're the only person besides me who's ever read his own words about that place. Tell me what it looks like up there now. I want to hear it from somebody who's actually stood on that floor." Bethany told her everything. The way morning light came through the tower's cracked windows in long yellow bars, the smell of wood smoke that had settled into the walls so deep it would probably never leave, the rope she'd coiled and recoiled a dozen times just to get the knot right. The woman listened with her eyes half closed, like she was walking the floor herself, and when Bethany finished, she was quiet a long moment before she said, "He'd want somebody living in it, not a museum, a person." That was how the conversation turned, plain and unhurried, from memory into practical matters. The woman knew a man at the county office who handled land records, someone who owed her a favor from years back over a fence line dispute. Within a week, Bethany was sitting across a scarred wooden desk with both of them, watching the clerk squint at the copied parcel description in the ranger's own hand, comparing it against old survey plats until the numbers lined up. It wasn't fast. There were forms to fill out twice, a fee she paid mostly in cash she'd saved from odd jobs, a lease-to-own agreement drawn up in language she had to ask the daughter to translate twice before it made sense. But it was real, a legal foothold, a few acres including the lookout site, hers to build on so long as she kept paying and kept working it. She rode back up the mountain with the papers folded inside her coat, like something that might blow away if she wasn't careful. The cabin looked the same when she returned, patient, half-lit, smelling of dust and old smoke. But she moved through it differently now, not as a trespasser waiting to be caught, but as someone with a claim to defend. She spent the first days just walking the boundary lines on the hand-drawn map, matching them to the ranger's copied description, learning the shape of what she owned by foot. Then, the real work started. The tower stairs had rotted through in 3 places, the treads soft and spongy where water had gotten in over the decades. She hauled up lumber a few boards at a time, measuring twice against the old joists before she cut anything, learning the hard way that a stair riser cut a half-inch short would mean a stumble every single trip up. She rebuilt them plank by plank through the last warm weeks of summer, testing her weight on each one before moving to the next, the hammering echoing down the slope morning after morning. The air had already started to turn by the time she reached the top landing, a coolness threading through the pines in the evenings, the light going amber earlier each day, a signal that autumn was coming, whether the stairs were finished or not. The last tread went in on a Tuesday, the wood still pale and raw against the silvered boards around it, and she stood on it a long moment before climbing higher, testing the give of each step the way she'd done every day for weeks. Nothing groaned. Nothing gave. At the top, the catwalk ran solid under her boots, the railing she'd rebolted holding firm when she leaned her full weight against it and looked out over the ridge she now had a paper claiming as her own, filed and stamped at the county office with a woman's careful signature beside hers. Below the tower, the garden she'd dug into the cleared ground beside the cabin was going quiet for the season, the last of the beans pulled, the squash vines browning at the edges, but the rows themselves, straight and turned, ready for next spring, in a way that made the whole slope feel less like a wilderness and more like a place someone lived. The cabin door stood open most days now, the plank and bolt seal she'd first pried loose months ago replaced with a hinge that swung easy, the stove inside drawing clean after she'd finally cleared the last of the old soot from the flue. Wool blankets she'd aired and mended were folded on the bunk. The oil lamps burned steady in the evenings. The coiled rope hung from its peg by the door, ready for use instead of relic. She'd started her own logbook in August, a plain notebook bought in town, and she'd taken to writing in it the way the old ranger once had. Short lines, dates, weather, work done. Stair riser /care 9 replaced. Garden watered. Roof patch holding through rain. It wasn't the same hand, wasn't the same voice, but it filled the same kind of quiet, one entry answering another across more than 30 years, as if the log had simply paused rather than ended. Now, in the gray hour before dawn, she climbed the finished stairs one more time, coffee cooling in a tin cup, and stood at the rail as the sky over the ridge began to lighten from ash gray to a thin gold at the seams. The pines below held their shape slowly out of the dark. Smoke rose faint and steady from her own chimney, the first fire of the cooling season, and somewhere down the mountain, the trail she'd cleared with her own hands ran quiet and open all the way back to the road, no longer a thing to be found but a thing that led home. She didn't think of it as luck anymore, what had brought her here. The collapsed rock, the sealed door, the names traced through dusty ledgers. It had taken work to turn a discovery into a life. But the sun came up clean over Cinder Ridge, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like moving on.